Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right in and unpack the sheer massive scale of Buddhism and Hinduism and really dig into their deep, complex historical connection. I mean, we're talking about two of the most profound and influential systems of thought in human history, shaping the lives of literally billions of people. But to truly understand them, we have to look at how they relate to one another. So to kick things off, we've got to ask a pretty wild question. How did two incredibly distinct paths grow from the exact same Iron Age Indian soil? They share spiritual DNA, they use the exact same vocabulary, and yet they grew apart in some profoundly fundamental ways. It's just a fascinating story of shared heritage, intense philosophical rivalry, and millennia of intertwining history. All right, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Born from the same soil. 2. Shared concepts and practices. 3. The Great Philosophical Divide. 4. Social order and authority. And 5. Intertwined histories and exchanges. Let's start with Section 1. Born from the same soil, the origins of two giants. Picture the Iron Age in India, a period we call the Second Urbanization. It was an absolute melting pot of intellectual ferment that gave rise to both of these traditions side by side, right there in the Gangetic Plains. Around 600 BCE, you have the composition of the Upanishads within the Vedic tradition. Then, shortly after, around 500 BCE, we see the rise of Buddhism. And later on, roughly 200 BCE, the Puranic Hindu synthesis really begins to form, bringing together ancient Vedic practices, indigenous Indus Valley cultures, and the influence of new ascetic movements. Basically, they were breathing the exact same intellectual air. Now, a super fascinating piece of this puzzle is the Shramana movement. You know, the Buddha himself was actually part of this wave of ascetic thinkers and renouncers. They operated parallel to, but decisively broke away from, the established Brahmanic traditions. They famously flat-out rejected the divine authority of the Vedas and the Upanishads, which really paved the way for a completely new perspective on spiritual liberation. Moving right along to Section 2, Shared Concepts and Practices, the Spiritual DNA. Because they grew out of that same environment, these two traditions share a massive amount of vocabulary. But here's the catch. While they use the exact same words, they can carry completely different meanings. Take concepts like karma, the idea that our actions carry ethical weight. That idea still dictates how billions of people live their daily lives right now. Both traditions fundamentally agree that our words, thoughts, and actions shape our future. And they share a deep, absolute commitment to ahimsa, or non-harming, as a core ethical virtue. Which brings us to samsara. Both cosmologies completely agree that living beings are essentially trapped in this constant, repetitive cycle of rebirth. Driven by karma, we wander through multiple realms, from the deepest, darkest hells all the way up to the highest celestial deva realms. And for both of these traditions, the ultimate, highest goal of the spiritual life is to finally escape this cycle and achieve complete liberation. If we compare Patanjali and yoga, which is a hugely influential system in Hinduism, with Buddhism, the structural parallels are just striking. Both of them identify suffering, or dukkha, as the primary problem of ordinary reality. Both prescribe rigorous ethical training and deep, concentrated states of meditation as the method to get free. And both seek that ultimate end of suffering, whether they call it kaivalya or nirvana. All right, Section 3, the Great Philosophical Divide, the sibling rivalry. Okay, so here's the massive plot twist. This is where these sibling religions completely part ways on the literal nature of existence. In Hindu philosophy, especially the Vedanta school, liberation is found by realizing the Atman, the true, permanent, unchanging, eternal self. Buddhism, on the other hand, absolutely rejects this. The Buddha taught anatman, or not self. Buddhism argues that consciousness is constantly in flux, and that clinging to the illusion of a permanent self is exactly what causes our suffering in the first place. And this disagreement, it scales all the way up to the cosmos. Hindu thought centers on Brahman, an ultimate reality that is an immaterial, eternal, creative cause, often aligned with a creator deity or a cosmic consciousness. Buddhist metaphysics, however, relies on dependent arising. They argue that all phenomena arise dependently based on causes and conditions, strictly rejecting the idea of a supreme creator god or some single universal source. This philosophical split also came down to epistemology, basically how we actually know what we know. Early Buddhists prioritized direct, empirically known meditative experience over everything else. In one great historical critique, the Buddha criticized the unverified, blind transmission of Vedic scriptures, famously comparing their lineage to a file of blind men holding on to each other. For early Buddhists, you couldn't just take someone's word for it. You had to see and experience the truth for yourself through high degrees of mental concentration. That brings us to Section 4, Social Order and Authority, Philosophy in Practice. Now, these abstract philosophical debates didn't just stay up in the clouds. They hit the ground and profoundly shaped real-world society and social hierarchies. In Vedic Brahmanism, the Varna or caste system was seen as divinely ordained. Brahmins held inherent spiritual authority simply by their birthline. Well, Buddhism completely rejected this divine justification. The Buddha taught a universal moral law that applies equally to everyone, famously offering ordination into the monastic sangha to all people, totally regardless of their social class. For Buddhists, spiritual purity came from your actions, not your bloodline. There's this incredibly powerful quote from the Sutta Nipata that perfectly captures the shift. The Buddha actively redefined the very word Brahmin. He took a term that meant a hereditary priest by birth and completely flipped it, turning it into a term for anyone who attains spiritual liberation and purity through pure ethical deeds. It was a real game changer. And finally, Section 5, Intertwined Histories and Exchanges, a Millennia of Mingling. So despite having these incredibly fierce debates, these two traditions lived as next-door neighbors for thousands of years, constantly borrowing from and influencing each other. In this fascinating historical crossover, post-Puranic Hinduism actually incorporated the Buddha as an avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu. Now, in texts like the Bhagavata Purana, this was often neutrally framed as a tactic, where Vishnu descended as the Buddha just to trick demons into abandoning Vedic rites so they'd lose their power. But over time, other Hindu texts and poets really celebrated this avatar out of a shared compassion for animals and a deep desire to end bloody sacrifices. At the exact same time as Buddhism spread, especially in its Mahayana and Vajrayana branches, it adopted a ton of Hindu deities into its own cosmology as protectors or bodhisattvas. Deities like Saraswati, Ganesha, Mahakala, and Indra are widely depicted in Buddhist scriptures. This massive overlap led to shared temples and holy sites stretching all the way from India and Nepal to Cambodia's incredible Angkor Wat, where both of these traditions have left their undeniable mark. Modern thinkers have really emphasized just how much these traditions actually needed each other. Swami Vivekananda famously pointed out that the centuries of intense philosophical debate we've looked at today didn't just cause division. They actually sharpened the intellects, the epistemology, and the logic of both sides, pushing Indian philosophy to absolute heights. So I want to leave you with a pretty provocative thought to ponder. If two paths can be so fundamentally opposed on the actual metaphysics of the universe, literally disagreeing on the existence of the soul, yet remain so intimately aligned on ethics, meditation, and the ultimate escape from suffering, what does that actually teach us about the nature of religion itself? It really forces us to expand our definitions, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I encourage you to keep questioning, keep learning, and absolutely keep exploring the fascinating roots of our world's greatest ideas.